2020, the future. 2020 always sounded like this ominous, faraway year. As a kid, there were these books, detailing with very specific graphical illustrations how absolutely mind-blowing the future would be. Depicting cities with gigantic megastructures and skyscrapers, with abundant monorails everywhere, and yes, of course, also with the obligatory flying cars. Then there were movies like Back to the Future 2, which made us excited about the future, showing us self-lacing shoes, hoverboards, and futuristic looking cars. 2020 always sounded like a promise, an omen, and that's why many sci-fi movies from back then play around this time. It always seemed so far off, yet we all knew that we would witness the year 2020.
What wonders would we find? And space exploration, of course, always played a major role in that future. Off-world colonies in Blade Runner, the giant rotating Wheel space station, and the giant Clayville's moon base from 2001: A Space Odyssey. The cheesy yet very detailed depiction of a future moon base in space 1999. And now here we are. We are in the future. But somehow, the future is far different than the one we imagined. Therefore, we must rightfully ask the question, where is our damn promised moon base?
If you could travel back in time to the 60s, you would of course first go to Woodstock and watch some legendary performances, for example, Jimi Hendrix. Then you probably might end up taking lots of drugs because that was almost customary at such festivals back then. Then you would reveal at some point that you are from the future, from 2020. People would then ask you with amazement, "Wow, how is it like in the future? How many times were you already in space? How many times did you travel to the moon?" With quite some embarrassment, you would then tell those people that there is no moon base in 2020. In fact, getting to space in 2020 is really exactly the same as in their time. It is reserved to a small group of highly trained individuals in service to some government agencies, which are still mostly the same agencies as in their time. They would stare at you with absolute disbelief. No one back then would have believed you that by 2020 humanity would not have a moon base. No one. Yet here we are, in this weird timeline, where historical events went down a very weird path. A timeline which is so bizarre that sometimes it feels like this is a wrong timeline and that we should actually be much further developed technologically than we actually are nowadays.
Now for sure we have some excellent consumer electronics, like smartphones or giant flat panel OLED TVs. And also some really insane computer graphics, which are all amazing developments. So don't get us wrong. Yet still, there's major disappointment. The most important things we were looking forward to have not materialized. Okay, we can live without mega structures. We can even live without the flying cars, at least for a few more years. At least we got a mediocre version of the self-lacing shoes. But we really cannot live without a moon base. Sorry. This is just an epic fail. Something went brutally wrong at some point in the timeline, which made our timeline suck. That's the impression we always have.
It is absolutely fascinating, in our opinion, to speculate about alternate history. And there are just so many fascinating what-if questions. What if Maxentius, not Constantine, would have won the battle at the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD? What if Hieron of Alexandria would have taken his idea of the spinning steam-powered toy further and would have invented the steam engine already almost 2000 years ago? What if the assassination of Abraham Lincoln or John F. Kennedy would have failed? What if World War I never happened? And so on and so forth. So it's only natural to ask why space travel didn't develop as basically everyone imagined it back in the 50s and 60s. What went wrong? By the way, there's a very good show on Apple TV exploring this notion. It's called For All Mankind, and even though it has some weaknesses, we can highly recommend it.
Now, in order to understand why space travel didn't develop the way it had been imagined. We of course must recap the event of the space race, which began with the launch of Sputnik, the first man-made satellite to be launched into Earth orbit in 1957 by the Soviet Union. America was shocked. So as we know, Sputnik led to the famous space race, which was in essence nothing more than two rival superpowers engaged in a fierce competition to show off who was cooler and more powerful, who was able to achieve more daring accomplishments, who was superior to the other. Until the early 60s, the Soviet Union was clearly ahead. They had all the firsts. The first artificial satellite in orbit, the first landing of a probe on the moon, the first pictures of the far side of the moon, and then even the first man in space. It wasn't looking so good for Uncle Sam in this competition for the longest time. NASA was actually founded as a direct result of the Soviet space advances in 1958, with the single goal to counteract the Soviets and to win the space race. Sounds actually quite familiar to today's situation of the US Space Force being founded as a direct result to China's growing power in space. Anyways, we all know the history. It was beginning to crystallize that the US would win the race. By Christmas 1968, 3 American astronauts were circling the moon with Apollo 8. Meanwhile, the Soviets were preparing their N-1 rocket for launch. Maybe they could still win, even though the US was ahead. So the 21st of February 1969 approaches, and the Soviets are readying their giant rocket, which rivals the Saturn V, for launch. The launch day comes, and the N-1 lifts off. Everything was looking good at first, but after 1 minute, the rocket exploded. The second launch attempt on the 3rd of July also ended in failure, and this failure was incredibly spectacular. Luckily, through some kind of miracle, no one was killed, and contrary to some popular belief, this was not the biggest non-nuclear explosion in history. Sorry to disappoint you. As it was found out, most of the kerosene had not exploded, so the blast yield was likely around 1 kilotons of TNT equivalent. The largest non-nuclear explosions in history was the minor scale and Misty picture test conducted at the White Sands Missile Range in 1985 and 1987 respectively. In fact, quite a few other explosions were more devastating than the N-1 explosion. But still, the explosion was insane enough. And only 17 days after the second failed N-1 test, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. The Soviets knew it was over. They had lost the race.
Yet still, they continued and tried to get the rocket working. 2 further tests were conducted on the 26th of June 1972 and one on the 23rd of November 1972. Both also ended in failure. By 1972, 12 American astronauts had walked on the moon. Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16 and 17 all conducted successful missions on the lunar surface, and with the Soviets failing to get their N-1 working properly, the US had no competition. The US was the sole, lonely victor.
If the N-1 rocket tests had been successful, the space race between the US and the Soviet Union would have continued. The US and the Soviet Union would have carried out many more moon missions, leading to the establishment of our first moon bases.
And since this whole race was only politically motivated, the short-sighted politicians saw no need to continue the program. We often hear reasons like the public interest was waning, or the costs were too high, or the Vietnam War was in focus. These reasons are all true to some extent, and they all played a role, but the biggest one why the Apollo missions weren't continued is because they were politically motivated. And we all know that politicians are, let's say euphemistically, not very far-sighted. These people have no clue about the long-term benefits of spaceflight. They have no clue about all the offshoot technologies that are a direct result of the Apollo flights and which we use to this day. They don't know that every dollar invested into the space economy flows back into the economy and generates a few dollars on top. So already by 1968, when it was becoming clear that the US would win the race against the Soviets, funding for Apollo-related moon projects was cancelled. The Apollo Applications Program was cancelled by the Lyndon B. Johnson administration already before the first astronauts even set foot upon the moon. This program foresaw the building of a moon base. As crazy as it sounds, but the plans were all there. NASA had a perfectly worked out plan to build not only one moon base, but several moon bases in the years following the Apollo moon landings. And according to these plans, the first Apollo moon landings were but to be only the beginning of a greater plan, to slowly build up a permanent US presence on the moon. After the initial Apollo missions, longer and longer stay times on the moon would have been carried out. The Goodyear Stay Time Extension Module, for example, was an expandable habitat which was already undergoing tests, ready to be deployed on the moon in the later Apollo missions. It would have allowed for stay times of 2 astronauts for up to 2 weeks. Then by 1973 it was foreseen to build a larger, stronger version of the Saturn V rocket called the Extended Launch Vehicle Configuration, which would have been able to deliver 85 metric tons to the surface of the moon. That is almost as much as Starship.
The first larger habitat shelters would have been deployed, allowing 3 astronauts an uninterrupted lunar stay time of 90 days per shelter. A pressurized moon rover was also foreseen. Power would have been supplied by multiple 10 kilowatt nuclear thermoelectric generators. These systems were part of the so-called Lunar Exploration Systems for Apollo, or short LESA. As part of the later phases of the Apollo Applications Program, larger and larger LESA moon base camps would have been built. By the late 70s, the next phase in the LESA moon base evolution would have been initiated, with larger shelters being deployed and covered by lunar regolith in order to protect from solar and cosmic radiation and meteorites. These larger LESA moon shelters would have allowed dozens of people to stay on the moon for months in a row. By the 80s, it was foreseen that at least 4 such bases would be in operation, with one of them even on the far side of the moon, to carry out radio astronomy observations. By 2001, the date where the legendary 2001 A Space Odyssey takes place, the depiction of the Clavius moon base could have been a reality in this timeline. It wouldn't even have been so exaggerated. In this alternative timeline, crewed missions to Mars would probably have happened by the late 90s. Nuclear thermal propulsion spaceships would have been developed by that time. In this alternative 2020, we would have large cities on the moon, with probably tens of thousands of people living there, and Mars bases with hundreds of people. But in our timeline, as we already said, even before the first man landed on the moon, funding for NASA was starting to decline severely, as seen on this graph here. NASA's budget peaked at around 4.4% of the US federal budget, and afterwards just declined massively. So yes, even at its height, NASA's budget was only a fraction of the military budget. And of course, a raging war in Vietnam didn't help space exploration. The Nixon administration wanted to cancel all missions after Apollo 15, but Nixon was talked out of it. By early 1970 already, Apollo 20 had been cancelled, and later that same year, Apollo 19 and 18 followed. At the latest in that year, it became pretty clear that all our dreams of a moon base had been shattered by short-sighted thinking of the Nixon administration. The whole Apollo program cost around $155 billion, inflation adjusted.
Now the Vietnam War cost almost 10 times as much, cost many human lives on top, and didn't even achieve victory for the US. On the contrary, it was a very costly humiliation for the United States. And regarding space, now suddenly a space plane seemed hip. A space station in low Earth orbit also seemed super hip now. Now we all know how that turned out. The space shuttle was a massive failure. It cost gigantic amounts of money and could not live up to its promise of delivering a fast, reusable spaceplane. In fact, refurbishing the space shuttle after every launch cost over $100 million, and it would take months for the shuttle to be able to fly again, not merely days as it was initially foreseen. The whole shuttle program cost about $250 billion in 2020 inflation-adjusted dollars, so more than the entire Apollo program, and effectively confined any space activity to low Earth orbit. And on top, the space shuttle even suffered some major disasters and cost quite a few human lives. Therefore, the space shuttle was finally retired in 2011. But the US had thus retired its sole only capability to fly to space. So here we are now in this weird 2020, and only now, if this time the weather won't interfere, will we be able to witness the first launch of US astronauts to the ISS from US soil since the retirement of the space shuttle. And if it wasn't for SpaceX, the situation would be very dire. Only now, thanks to SpaceX, we slowly start feeling this returning excitement for space exploration again. Only now in 2020, where we should have had a presence on the moon since decades already, we start feeling the excitement return for plans to colonize the moon and Mars.
Elon Musk is restoring the timeline, as we like to say. Somehow, as if the universe knows that the timeline is flawed, it has given us Elon Musk. And Elon always said that he was deeply inspired by the amazing achievement of the Apollo missions. And listening to some of his remarks, it's very clear that he is also very disappointed by the decline of spaceflight following the cancellation of the Apollo program.
Yeah, but so this will enable the creation of a lunar base. And it's 2017. I mean, we should have a lunar base by now. What the hell's going on?
So the cancellation of Apollo led to a huge disappointment for many people. The moon workers themselves were brutally disappointed. Buzz Aldrin and Eugene Cernan often publicly criticized US politics for failing to return to the moon.
We landed, explored, got back up again, rendezvoused, came back. That's 50 years of non-progress. I think we all ought to be a little ashamed that we can't do better than that.
It's disappointing. It was a period of time from 13 years of my life, but from Shepard in 61 to Apollo 17 and 72, we busted that door to the future open. We busted it open for those walking in our footsteps to go on through it. And here we are, literally 4 decades later, and we can't even get an American into space on an American piece of hardware. We've come full circle, taking the leadership away from the old Soviet Union to giving it back to them a half a century later. Now, what's wrong with that headline? You know, we had a headline, American steps foot on the moon. And now the headlines are, golly, we're sending clean laundry to the space station. What's wrong with that? That's what bothers me tremendously, and we haven't been afraid to say it. What we've said publicly has been challenged by a lot of people, but that's just what we believe.
But fortunately, we have Elon now. We should be really grateful to have him, because this will be the first time in history where we can build moon bases and later on Mars bases in a sustainable way. The big advantage we have now, thanks to Elon and SpaceX, is that we have reusable rockets, which drive down the costs for space exploration drastically. Starship will of course be the ultimate combination of reusability, enabling humanity to cost-effectively settle on the moon, whereas the launch of one Saturn V rocket cost around $1 billion inflation-adjusted. The launch of one Starship will cost 1,000 times less, because it will be fully reusable. So the only real cost will be the propellant. The reduction in costs by a factor of 1,000 or even more in the case of Mars, will eventually allow us to create a sustainable space economy. And this is the major difference to the Apollo era. Apollo failed because it was politically motivated and not economically motivated.
Without political support, it was unfortunately not sustainable. However, SpaceX's efforts don't depend on political support. That's why this time a moon base can and will happen much easier than back then. We will soon be able to build a moon base at the fraction of the price of what it would have cost in the 70s. And the giant revenue from Starlink will basically give SpaceX the necessary funds to carry out crewed missions to the moon and to Mars. This time, no short-sighted idiot politician will cancel SpaceX's efforts. No war, no lack of public interest, not a lack of political support will cancel Starship and our future moon and Mars bases. Because this time, it is driven by a company, it is driven by economics, and it is driven by a visionary. We can call ourselves extremely lucky to be able to witness the birth of Starship and this renewed interest in space, because what we are witnessing here is the restoration of the timeline. The future that we were promised back then is materializing now. It has only been delayed. And we can thank this guy here for making it happen. So thanks, Elon, from the bottom of our hearts for restoring the timeline.
So do you agree with us that Elon is now fixing our timeline? And this time we will have our promised moon bases because it will be economically also viable.
Or did we just watch too many sci-fi movies? Which could also be. And on the topic of the moon, we also did a video on the moon Starship which was presented, so you can watch the video right here.
We explored every single detail of this new render. So thanks for watching the JS Space Report.
And then I would say, on to the future!